I'm going to focus my remarks this afternoon on really providing an update on the President's legacy in the climate resilience and preparedness space, and also hopefully provide some provocative ideas and suggestions for the path forward beyond this administration. But to dive right in, as documented in the National Climate Assessment and amplified by the President in the hurricane season briefing this week, the effects of climate change are already underway and are already being felt, with rising sea levels, increased frequency and severity of tropical storms, and increased disruptions of inland precipitation patterns. We're seeing this unfold even in the southern plains this week. This is a very tough time to be in Texas. I say this as a former Texan as well. So with my background, having been forged in the crucible that is Texas environmental and land use politics, I may occasionally refer to that background, where I used to do some community organizing and also community planning and disaster resilience work. But really I'll be focused more on the legacy of the President's Climate Action Plan, and specifically the ways that we've gone about better identifying, communicating, and ultimately reducing the risks and costs associated with extreme weather and other effects of climate change. I'll be really emphasizing flood risk, tropical storms, and both coastal and inland riverine flood issues, but I also want to talk a little bit about the financial sector. But first, a few words about hurricanes. Damage from hurricanes is expected to increase significantly in the coming decades, both because of the effects of climate change, but also because of the effects of continued patterns of intensification of risk or coastal development. In turn, the potential requests for federal disaster relief and recovery efforts are anticipated to increase as well. So we've estimated that the magnitude of these increases in hurricane damage and the associated amounts of federal aid that will be requested and rolling out of the federal government to the states is expected to increase. We look at the combination of the physical effects of climate change along with the state and local land use development patterns working in combination that result in this increase in loss and increase in cost. So over time, these costs are anticipated to rise rapidly and also become a greater share of gross domestic product, or GDP. For example, under our current estimates, the annual damage is currently estimated to be approximately 0.16% of GDP. This is average annualized damage of about $28 billion. This is $28 billion. By 2075, however, that figure is estimated to increase to 0.22%, an equivalent of roughly $39 billion in today's economy. Approximately 45% of that increase is attributed to climate change, but 55% of that increase is attributed to coastal development patterns. So what I'm saying there is, even if we stabilize GHG emissions today, there are certain changes that are baked into the system physically as well. You all have been talking about that and learning about that. But even if climate impacts were to stabilize, just under the current rates of flood damage that we see associated with hurricanes, because of the anticipated increase in coastal development patterns, those losses are anticipated to continue to rise. So for example, right now, approximately 0.4% of the US population is currently living in counties where hurricane damage is a factor. But we anticipate that by 2075, there will be an increase of greater than 5% of the county's average that would increase in an intensification of those development patterns. So I didn't put that very well, but what that means is that the share will rise to 2.1% rather than just the current 0.4% of the population. So currently, we see approximately 1.2 million people that are living in counties that are vulnerable to hurricane impacts. By 2075, that's anticipated to rise to 10 million people. I understand that you all have been hearing about climate impacts, so I don't necessarily need to get into the effects of the troposphere or GHG emissions and how that translates into increased sea surface temperatures, how the relationship between a warming environment and warming seas contribute to increased tropical storm activity. I think you all have been getting into that over the course of your deliberations. But the way that translates into increased downpours, especially over the last 3 to 5 decades, is significant. So we're seeing inland that the heaviest rainfall events have become more heavy and more frequent, and the amount of rain falling on these heavy rain events are also increasing. So since 1991, the amount of rain falling in very heavy precip events has been significantly above average. And according to the National Climate Assessment, this increase has been greatest in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Upper Great Plains, more than 30% above the 1901 to 1960 average. There's also been a concomitant increase in flood events in the Midwest and in the Northeast, where the largest increase in these heavy rain amounts have been occurring. Worldwide, between 1980 and 2009, floods caused more than 500,000 deaths and affected more than 2.8 billion people. In the US, between 1959 and 2005, this is inclusive of Hurricane Katrina, we saw more than 4,500 deaths just in the US alone. The property and crop damage averages nearly $8 billion a year. That's in 2011 dollars between 1981 and 2011. And between 1980 and 2013, floods caused just in the US more than $260 billion in damage. We also see an increase in the percentage of these losses that are being borne through the federal government. So this is all of us as taxpayers. Where previously, if you looked in closer to the 1960s, the share of tropical storms that were declared as disasters that ended up resulting in federal disaster relief was less than 10%. As we move through the storms of the 1990s, particularly the 1993 Midwest floods, the storms of 2005, including Rita, Wilma, and Katrina, and then as recently as Hurricane Sandy, we see that share of the federal taxpayer dollar being brought to bear more and more in the burden for repairing damage from these storms. So by the time we're up to Hurricane Sandy, upwards of 80% of the storm damage from Hurricane Sandy and those repairs was being borne by the federal government in various forms of disaster assistance. So that disaster assistance will move through, I'm going to focus really on 3 primary agencies and programs. First and foremost is going to be FEMA with the disaster relief program. And that is an individual assistance that is very limited. It does not make people whole. It's also public assistance. This is for major community works and infrastructure projects. And then those are primarily going to be through supplemental appropriations. But then there's another part of FEMA's program that's not discretionary, and those are payouts through the National Flood Insurance Program. So I'm going to refer back to that a little bit later. But other programs that are playing an increasing role in federal disaster assistance are through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and the Community Development Block Grant Program, or CDBG. That is an annual program that also has a sister program that comes to bear in disasters called the Community Development Block Grant / Disaster Relief, or CDBG-DR. Again, through Katrina on up into Hurricane Sandy, we see more and more of these HUD CDBG-DR dollars coming to bear. So most recently, out of a $60.4 billion disaster relief package that was appropriated by the Congress for Sandy, more than $16 billion of that moved through HUD. The third department or program that I will point to that I think is a very important one is the Department of Transportation. We see significant appropriations moving through the Federal Department of Transportation, particularly for Sandy, primarily to address federal aid highways, but also the Federal Transit Administration and those transit systems and transportation infrastructure that were damaged by Sandy. There are also significant appropriations that move through the federal government, including to NOAA, to EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, for wastewater treatment plants and systems, through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for coastal and other flood control infrastructure, and there are others, but looking primarily at DOT, FEMA, and HUD, I think is where we see a significant amount of opportunity to look at ways to better manage risk and buy it down. So I would emphasize that where we have current patterns trending upward in the instances, the frequency and severity of major precip and coastal storm events, the percentage of the repairs and the costs being borne by the federal treasury, and an increasing percentage of GDP associated with extreme weather events and climate change, we see ultimately a pattern that is unsustainable, both from an ecological standpoint, from a social standpoint, and also from an economic standpoint. So what are we to do? Flood risk professionals have long recognized that the so-called 100-year standard, the 100-year flood, or what we now call the 1% annual chance flood, because that's so much more clear, is generally no longer viewed as being adequate to protect life, to protect property, and increasingly state and local governments have recognized that that 1% annual chance or 100-year standard is not enough for them either. So we see more than 4 states and literally thousands of local governments that have moved away from regulating development just using this 100-year standard, recognizing that upwards of 40% of our flood losses are occurring outside the 100-year floodplain. So state and local governments are using margins of safety or setbacks. They may require new development or post-disaster rebuilding to meet a higher standard of protection. When that's a vertical standard of protection above a flood elevation, we call that freeboard. It's a nautical term. But it basically means we would take the base flood elevation that the 100-year flood would be anticipated to reach, and we would add an additional, whether it's a foot or 2 feet or 3 feet, some coastal communities or communities that have very deep floodplains behind levees might be using 4 feet or even 5 feet of freeboard. They may also require setbacks that could be measured in horizontal feet off of their floodplain. They may also require things like a no-rise floodplain. This means that any new development that acts like a brick in the bathtub has to be mitigated. You can't have new development take up space that would raise the elevation of the base flood. That's got to be mitigated. So there are lots of measures that state and local governments have long taken, and there are several others that can get more technical. But this is really all with an eye towards stabilizing and ultimately reducing flood risk in their own jurisdiction. And yet, as was noted in the introduction, federal practice has been largely the same for more than a generation, going back to the National Flood Insurance Program that first promulgated this so-called 100-year floodplain. So it really fell to the federal government to revisit this. And this is why the president included in his climate action plan a call for federal agencies to take another look at the way that they conduct business in and around floodplains and to update those standards to better reflect current reality and also to better align with the leadership that state and local governments have been showing. So the president issued in January of last year Executive Order 13690. This is Executive Order 13690, that modified, again, for the first time in nearly 40 years, the way that the federal government goes about doing business in and near floodplains. It produces a flexible framework that agencies can choose from and really builds on a pilot, if you will, where for the first time the federal government acknowledged for itself that the so-called 100-year standard is not good enough, not when we're spending your money. So remember the $60.4 billion in supplemental appropriations that I mentioned earlier after Hurricane Sandy to help rebuild from that damage? There was a rule that was, or a standard that was issued by the Sandy Rebuilding Task Force that said when you're going to use that $60.8 billion to rebuild roads and bridges and wastewater treatment plants and homes and businesses and fire stations, but if you're going to do it with federal money, you're going to use best available data for elevation plus 1 foot. And this was really extraordinary. It was for the first time recognizing in our nation's history that this 100-year standard is not good enough, not when we're spending your money. So we built on that through the executive order and the promulgation of the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard that provides this flexible framework for agencies to choose from. They can either use climate-informed science, so they're not just going to take the FEMA flood insurance rate map that shows that 100-year floodplain. They're going to need to develop and use climate-informed science that takes into account things like the expected life of the asset. How long do we want it to last? And what do we expect climate impacts like sea level rise or changes in inland precipitation to look like over the life of that project? But we also recognize that climate-informed science is still in development, right? There are places where there are very robust sources of data, very advanced models, we've got strong assumptions, but until we have climate data that's available down to the planning scale that could tell us if this building gets torn up, how much higher do we need to build it if we want it to last for 50 years? Until we really have that crisp data available online, there are 2 other options that are available for agencies to choose from. One of them is to use the 500-year floodplain where FEMA has produced that. And so rather than the 1% annual chance, this is the 0.2% annual chance because that's so much more clear. But the 500-year floodplain hasn't been mapped everywhere. We mainly find the 500-year floodplain on the FEMA flood insurance rate maps in densely populated urbanized areas where FEMA has included that in their mapping effort. So there's a third option that agencies can use for their planning and siting and designing of the things that they pay for with your money. If it's a critical facility, things like fire stations, hospitals, evacuation centers, or emergency operations centers, if it's a road that is used for evacuation, anything that's critical, it has to be built to the base flood elevation plus 3 feet. Everything else, base flood elevation plus 2 feet. So this really comes in line with what we see state and local governments doing. It also aligns with the standards being brought forward by the American Society of Civil Engineers and their ASCE 24. It aligns with standards of practice through planning, engineering, emergency management, and floodplain management communities. But again, importantly, it aligns with what state and local governments are already doing in many respects. So agencies are currently going through the process right now of looking at their rules and their procedures and thinking about how they go about building and designing the things that are paid for with federal dollars. So in the case of FEMA and that individual assistance, that public assistance, the hazard mitigation grant programs, the pre-disaster mitigation grant programs that they bring to bear in the wake of a disaster, they're looking at what's going to be involved in aligning to those three options, which one of those options they're going to be using under different circumstances. Additionally, housing and urban development is looking at what these standards mean for the Community Development Block Grant and for the CDBG-DR programs. DOT is looking at what it means for federal aid highway, for federal transit, for FAA and airports. Across the federal family, agencies are looking at what this means for federally funded projects. So I would say stay tuned and be ready, especially as journalists, to help tell the story of the way that agencies are proposing to implement and help an engaged public weigh in when proposed approaches go out for public comment. And for those members of the public or other stakeholders and federal partners that are here that will ultimately be helping to implement these rules and procedures, or ultimately be helping to grow your communities to be more resilient when you're using federal dollars. Be ready and help weigh in when these proposed rules are out for public comment, because this affects how we go about building those roads and bridges, those wastewater treatment plants, anywhere that it's a federally funded project. So I would really welcome perhaps later in my remarks if we wanted to get into some questions, particularly about the federal flood risk management standard. I won't get out ahead of any of the federal agency processes, so I wouldn't be able to answer any specific questions about what it means for a particular project or program. That's where the agencies are going to lead the way, but I would be happy to help clarify anything that I've explained so far. But additionally, we recognize that the federal government is not going to be going it alone here, right? There's tremendous private equity, private capital to be brought to bear. Remember that percentage of disaster recovery spending that I mentioned earlier, and how over the course of a generation, we went from, on average, the federal government ending up paying for approximately 10% of disaster recovery to now, under Hurricane Sandy, more than 80%. What does that really bode for the future when we think about it in two specific ways? One is, as more and more data come online and we understand climate impacts better, and we know that upwards of 40% of our flood losses are occurring outside the 100-year floodplain, and state and local governments in many respects have already said they don't use the 100-year for all of their development planning anyway. And the federal government, at least as a matter of high-level policy, has articulated that this 100-year standard isn't good enough for them. Well, what does it mean when new development gets damaged in a flood and a request for federal assistance is made, a request for a major disaster declaration is made? And what if this is to repair damage that was permitted after data were available to suggest that maybe different land development patterns were in order? Where I'm going with this is the Sandy supplemental appropriations debate took 90 days. This was after a major disaster that tore up the most densely populated urbanized area in the United States. And yet we still had a national conversation for 90 days about whether and how much to appropriate disaster recovery funds to these regions that were affected. So to what extent is it the responsibility of a taxpayer in the Midwest to continue to pay to repair damage in South Florida when we know that data suggest, at least, that there will be changes in sea level, there will be changes in inland precipitation? So this is where appropriators or some of those taxpayers and those taxpayer advocate groups may begin to ask, to what extent are these self-inflicted wounds? And why does it continue to be the responsibility of the federal taxpayer to pay to repair damage that was permitted by state and local governments that maybe should have known better. So these are the really tough questions that we need to be asking ourselves, because appropriators will be asking. And those taxpayer advocate groups and fiscal conservatives will be asking. So let's look at it through another lens too. When a local government chooses to permit new development so close to the floodplain, maybe it's even on a parcel that was previously flooded, and then somebody builds their home there, their greatest personal investment, and it's lost. If they were outside the 100-year floodplain, there's no federal requirement that it be insured. A lender might require it, that's up to them. But there's no federal requirement that it have insurance. So what happens when that home is lost? And whose responsibility is that? At what point was the builder put on notice? At what point was the homeowner put on notice? As a lawyer, my hope is to keep these things out of court. I might be one of the few lawyers out there whose goal is to try to keep stuff like this out of court. But there's a point at which these questions are going to get asked and are going to make their way into court. I would point the group to a recent Supreme Court decision out of the state of South Carolina, Columbia Venture versus Richland County. Columbia Venture versus Richland County. A decision of the South Carolina State Supreme Court upholding the county's authority to tell a developer, thank you but no thank you, when they wanted to bring a new development to that community's floodway. Not just their floodplain, but their floodway. This is an area inside the floodplain subject to the greatest flows, heights, and velocities. The developer even offered to build or improve an existing levee on the property and turn that levee over to the county for maintenance in perpetuity, and the county said no thank you. And because there's certain liability associated with owning and operating a levee, to say nothing of having to pay for the maintenance on that system forever. And so the developer sued, and they claimed a Fifth Amendment property rights taking, along with due process and some other things. But what they said basically is, we bought the land, we intended to develop it, and now you're telling us through FEMA's maps and other regulatory processes that we can't develop it the way that we intended. More than 10 years of litigation later, many, many millions of dollars in attorneys' fees and court costs later, ultimately the county's authority to manage flood risk in their community as they saw fit prevailed. But in some instances, nobody but the blood-sucking lawyers like me win. And so the cautionary tale that I would say here is, as data point toward flood risks and climate impacts that become more and more foreseeable, it's really going to fall to state and local government to manage and respond to those risks, and not just rely on FEMA's flood insurance rate maps to tell them where development should responsibly go. And when there's harm or a flood that affects that community outside the 100-year floodplain, a smart community is going to really think smart about how and where to rebuild, and maybe not rebuilding right where they were before. Because the data are telling us that the past is no longer prologue, and where we previously anticipated floods would go, where we previously anticipated the extent of storm surge, and we previously built things in a certain way based on those assumptions, those are no longer the conditions that we can anticipate going forward. So that data needs to be informing policy and practice, It's also, my concern is that it's going to be informing liability regimes and jurisprudence and the way this stuff plays out in front of judges and juries, imposing what's essentially a substantive knowledge standard. Mayor, you either knew or you should have known because the NOAA sea level rise viewer said so, or some other data set came online that told you this. But I'd mentioned earlier that state and local government and the federal government need not go it alone. There are really extraordinary opportunities now as more data also begins to impact markets. And it starts pointing toward things like insurance and the way that we go about identifying and underwriting risk and risk associated with projects. This is why the president also called for, in his climate action plan, an effort to work with the insurance industry and partner with that industry to find new ways to better identify and communicate risks associated with extreme weather and climate change, and ultimately to use insurance to buy down that risk. So we've been working with the insurance industry very actively for the last 2.5 years on 3 main efforts that I'm going to summarize briefly, but I think it translates directly into action that's very relevant on the ground. We know that we need to be increasing the sharing of data and information. The insurance industry has some of the most sophisticated data sets and modeling out there. Additionally, within the federal government, we have through forecast data, as well as data through the National Flood Insurance Program and data on our own federal facilities that the insurance industry is interested in. So we've been talking about ways that we can increase the sharing of data and modeling capacity and developing robust analytic tools to get those out to state and local governments and use those to be better informing planning decision making on the ground. But it can also be used to better inform basic benefit cost analysis. The more we know what a given mitigation measure can buy us and reduce risk, how much are we going to be reducing the susceptibility of an asset or the damage that asset may experience? But also, how much can we reduce the day-to-day carrying costs, even if there's never a disaster? Because we've reduced risk and we've reduced the insurance cost to own or occupy that space. And so the sharing of data and information is absolutely critical. But it really points to better information for building codes and standards. If I'm in 12 meetings a day, and I am, building codes comes up in 11 of the 12. It's that important. It's that ubiquitous. However, building code adoption and enforcement is very much a state and local government function. Now we're looking at what we can be doing through the federal government in terms of our own standards or the things that we pay for. But ultimately, it falls to state and local government to adopt standards and building codes and consistently enforce them in a way that reduces risk. The last area that we're collaborating is in how we go about financing the resilience retrofits that's necessary to reduce risk in advance of a disaster. After the disaster comes through, once the federal flood risk management standard is implemented, there's also a seismic standard that is getting some traction, and other measures that can be brought to bear even through state and local standards. The outcome should be more resilient if it's being rebuilt after a disaster. But what do we do in advance of a disaster? So we're even looking at ways to leverage future reductions in insurance to produce the front end capital so that families and businesses will have the funding that they need to buy down their risk, whether it's strengthening their roof or strengthening other parts of their building, elevating their structure, flood-proofing if it's commercial, or taking other measures to reduce risk in the community that actually translates into reduced cost. So these are things that we're working through with the insurance industry as well as lenders. And I can tell you that the credit rating agencies are keenly interested in this as well. And this will be the point that I'll wrap up with. When a credit rating agency asks a community, what are you doing about climate change? What are you doing to prepare your community for the effects of sea level rise? That really gets the attention of that community, because that credit rating agency determines the rating of the municipal bonds that that community is going to issue. That really gets at the DNA of local community decision making. So as the credit rating agencies start taking notice, this also really helps to inform across the financial sector a better understanding of what the effects of climate change will be, but also what some of those best practices are that state and local governments, tribes, and regional players are already undertaking to position themselves better. So that's where I think I'll wrap up. I know I've covered